The stories. This Appalachian trail shelter has a dark history. People like to romanticize the Appalachian Trail. They call it a ribbon of freedom, stretching 2,000 miles from Georgia to Maine. It's supposed to be a place of scenic vistas and trail magic. But for every sun-drenched peak, there are deep, shadowed hollows where the sun barely reaches the forest floor. In a remote section of the Nantahala National Forest in North Carolina, there sits a three-sided wooden structure known to hikers simply as the Deep Gap Shelter. On the map, it looks like any other rustic lean-to, but the locals, the trail runners, and the old-timers, they know better than to sleep there alone. In late November of 2018, a 29-year-old section hiker named Maya Vance arrived at Deep Gap just as the light was failing. Maya wasn't a novice. She had already crushed the Pacific Crest Trail and was known for her meticulous planning. She carried a lightweight setup, a Garmin InReach, and a can of bear spray strapped to her hip. She had planned to push 5 more miles that day, but a sudden, violent sleet storm forced her off the ridge and down into the gap. She was cold, her boots were soaked, and the shelter offered the only dry ground for miles. Maya dropped her pack on the rough-hewn floorboards. The shelter was empty. That was unusual for late November, even in bad weather. Usually, the bubble of southbound hikers would be passing through. But here, the silence was absolute. No bird calls, no wind in the trees. Just the heavy, wet patter of sleet hitting the tin roof. She started her camp routine: hang the bear bag, change into dry wool, boil water. It was mundane work. But then she noticed the first anomaly. On the far wall, etched deeply into the wood near the sleeping platform, was a series of vertical tally marks, 42 of them. They looked fresh, the wood still light and sap-stained against the gray logs. Below the marks, someone had carved a single word: waiting. Maya dismissed it as teenage graffiti. Just edgy nonsense left by weekend warriors. She set up her sleeping pad, ate her dehydrated chili, and tried to read. But she couldn't focus. She felt that primal itch between her shoulder blades. The feeling of being watched. At 8 p.m., Maya checked the shelter logbook. These notebooks are a staple of AT culture, a place for jokes and water updates. She pulled the battered composition book from the Ziploc bag on the wall. The last entry was dated 4 days prior. It was written by a hiker with the trail name Switchback. The entry was erratic. The handwriting started neat, but devolved into jagged strokes that tore the paper. It read, "Thought I was alone last night. I wasn't. Something was under the floor. Not an animal. It was humming. If you are reading this, check the loose board in the corner. I left it for you." Maya stared at the page. She knew of Switchback. He was a cheerful guy who wrote bad poetry in logs 50 miles back. This didn't sound like him. Maya looked at the corner of the shelter. In the dim beam of her headlamp, she saw a single plank that was slightly warped, sticking up about half an inch. Curiosity warring with dread, she walked over and hooked her fingers under the board. It lifted easily. The smell hit her instantly, a wave of copper and rot mixed with the sharp tang of ammonia. Lying in the dirt, wrapped in a black trash bag, was a bundle the size of a football. Maya pulled it out. Inside were 3 items: broken eyeglasses, a hiking boot with the sole ripped off, and a digital camera. The camera was an older Nikon. She pressed the power button. The battery flashed red, but the screen flickered to life. She scrolled to the playback. The first few photos were standard scenic shots. Then the timestamp jumped to 3 a.m. on the date of the last log entry. The photos were terrifying. They were flash photos taken in total darkness. The first shows the shelter floor, the second shows the woods, but the final photo froze Maya's blood. It was a picture taken from inside the crawl space, looking up through the cracks in the floorboards. In the photo, you can clearly see the underside of a sleeping pad and the silhouette of a person sleeping on top of it. Someone had been under the floor photographing Switchback while he slept. And now, Maya was holding the camera. Maya didn't scream. She didn't panic. Her training took over. She shoved the camera into her pocket, grabbed her bear spray, and backed out of the shelter into the freezing sleet. She left her tent, she left her pack, she ran. She kept her headlamp off, navigating by the gray light of the storm, stumbling over roots, moving blindly north toward the nearest road, crossing 6 miles away. She had covered maybe a mile when she heard it. Behind her, back at the gap, a high-pitched mechanical whistle echoed through the trees. It wasn't a bird, it was a signal. A few seconds later, a second whistle answered from the ridgeline directly ahead of her. She wasn't being chased by one person, she was being herded. She dove off the trail, sliding down a steep embankment into a thicket of rhododendron. She buried herself in the mud and dead leaves, clicking the safety off her bear spray. She lay there for hours, shivering violently. Twice, she saw beams of light sweep the trail above her, high-lumen tactical lights cutting through the sleet like lasers. The people holding them didn't speak. They moved with coordinated precision. They stopped directly above her hiding spot. Maya held her breath until her lungs burned. Then, one of them tapped a trekking pole against a rock. Click, click, click. A pause. Click, click, click. It was a code. The lights swept the woods one last time, missing her boot by inches before moving south back toward the shelter. Maya lay in the mud until sunrise. When the gray light of dawn broke, she crawled back to the trail and sprinted the remaining 5 miles to the road. She flagged down a logging truck, hysterical and hypothermic. The driver took her to the Bryson City police station. When she told her story and produced the camera, the mood in the station shifted from skepticism to grim recognition. The sheriff didn't look surprised. He looked tired. He explained that Deep Gap Shelter had a history not found in guidebooks. But what Maya found was different. The eyeglasses in the bag didn't belong to Switchback. They belonged to a hiker missing since 2015. The boot belonged to another hiker missing since 2017. The shelter wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a trophy case. The manhunt started at dawn. The Swain County tactical team moved in a phalanx, weapons drawn. But when they breached the shelter, they were met with silence. The structure stood empty. Maya's backpack was still there, soaked and frozen. Her sleeping bag was slashed open, feathers scattered like snow. But the most chilling detail was the floor. The loose board Maya had lifted was nailed shut. Someone had returned in the few hours between her flight and the police arrival. They used heavy-duty landscaping spikes to seal the crawl space. When officers pried it open, the space underneath was swept clean. The trash bag was gone. The earth showed fresh drag marks leading out the back of the shelter and down into a ravine so steep it was considered impassable. The evidence came from the camera Maya had kept. The forensic analysis took 3 weeks. The SD card contained over 400 images. Most were mundane, but the final 50 photos told a story of methodical stalking. The photos dated back months. There were pictures of hikers sleeping in 3 different shelters along a 50-mile stretch. The photographer had been hiding under floorboards, inside hollow logs, and up in rafters. The metadata revealed the camera originally belonged to David Horace, a hiker who vanished in 2016. The predator was using his victim's equipment to catalog new victims. The breakthrough came from a retired ranger named Elias Thorne. He recognized the whistling code Maya heard. He told investigators about squatters who lived in abandoned mica mines in the 80s, using bird mimics to communicate. The theory was that a remnant of this group had reoccupied the underground system. They weren't living in the woods, they were living under them. A cave rescue team mapped the shafts near Deep Gap. It was dangerous work. On the 3rd day, deep in a flooded shaft known as the Throat, divers found a waterproof pelican case. Inside were driver's licenses, 12 of them. They belonged to missing persons from 4 different states. Along with the IDs was a ledger. It wasn't a diary, it was an inventory. It listed gear: sleeping bag, titanium pot, Garmin GPS. Beside each item was a date. The implication was sickening. The perpetrators weren't killing for sport. They were killing for supplies. Hikers were just mobile convenience stores to them. The final piece of physical evidence was found a week later by a thermal drone. It picked up a heat signature in a dense laurel slick 2 miles north, a ventilation pipe sticking out of the ground. When the tactical team excavated, they found a bunker, 8 feet by 8 feet, dug into the hill. It was empty of people, but full of evidence. They found Switchback's journal. They found the missing boot. And on the wall, carved into the dirt, were the same tally marks Maya had seen. But here, the count was higher, 51 marks. The bunker had been abandoned recently, a pot of water was still warm on the stove, the occupants had been tipped off, likely monitoring police radio. They never caught the men responsible. The Deep Gap phantoms simply dissolved back into the wilderness. Maya Vance never hiked again. She moved to the coast, far from the woods, but she still sleeps with white noise playing, terrified of hearing that mechanical whistle. The shelter at Deep Gap was burned down by the Forestry Service in 2020, officially due to structural instability. But everyone knew the real reason. You can rebuild a shelter, but you can't scrub the feeling of being watched from the wood. Hikers who stray near that hollow still report finding odd things. Fresh footprints that end at solid rock walls, and the distinct coppery smell of a dirty root cellar wafting up from the ground. 3 campers whose last moments were found on tape. The discovery began with a discrepancy in the landscape that shouldn't have been there. It was late October of 2021, and Elias Thorne, a 62-year-old cattle rancher in southern Utah, was riding his fence line after a season of historic monsoons. The desert floor was usually a palette of muted browns and dusty reds, but something bright orange caught his eye nearly a quarter-mile off his property boundary. It wasn't on the ground. It was suspended 12 feet in the air, tangled violently in the branches of a twisted cottonwood tree that grew near a dry wash. Elias rode his horse closer, assuming it was a piece of industrial trash blown over from the highway construction miles away. When he got beneath the tree, he realized it was a high-end hiking backpack. The straps were shredded, and the fabric was caked in dried mud that had turned as hard as concrete. It took him nearly 20 minutes to cut it down using his pocket knife. The bag was heavy, wet, and smelled of stagnant river water, despite the nearest river being 40 miles south. Elias didn't open it. He recognized the Osprey logo and the serious nature of the gear. He tied it to his saddle and rode straight to the county sheriff's outpost, driven by a gut feeling that he was holding evidence of a tragedy. Inside that backpack, deputies found a wallet belonging to 22-year-old Mark Henderson. Mark, along with his 2 childhood friends, David Ross and Chloe Miller, had been the subject of a massive multi-state search and rescue operation that had gone cold 3 weeks prior. The trio had planned a last hurrah road trip across the American Southwest before starting their final year of university. They were not amateurs. Mark was a geology major who understood the terrain. David was a marathon runner with elite endurance. Chloe was a meticulous planner who had mapped out every fuel stop and trailhead on a spreadsheet shared with her parents. They had done everything right. They carried satellite beacons, extra water, and topographic maps. But the item that mattered most to the investigators wasn't the survival gear. It was a small, waterproof GoPro camera clipped to the front of the backpack's shoulder strap. The housing was cracked and the lens was scratched, but the SD card inside was intact. The footage recovered from that card provided a terrifying minute-by-minute account of how 3 intelligent, prepared people can vanish from the face of the earth in less than 60 seconds. The video files on the card began innocently enough, documenting the group's arrival at the trailhead of a remote slot canyon system near the Arizona border. It was a Tuesday morning in mid-September. The timestamp on the video read 8:14 a.m. The weather was perfect. The sky was a piercing, brilliant blue without a single cloud in sight. Mark is seen holding the camera, panning around the empty parking area, joking about how they have the entire wilderness to themselves. The temperature was already climbing past 80 degrees, and the air was bone dry. In the background, Chloe can be seen double-checking the weather report on her phone one last time before they lost cell service. The forecast called for a 0% chance of rain in their specific location. This was technically accurate. What the app didn't show, and what the group couldn't see from their vantage point on the ground, was a massive thermal instability building over a mountain range 50 miles to the north. In the high desert, distance is deceptive. A storm that feels a world away can become your problem in a matter of hours, traveling through the arteries of the earth with devastating speed. They entered the canyon just before 9 a.m. The footage from the next 2 hours is visually stunning. The sunlight filters down through the narrow crack in the sandstone, turning the walls into glowing sheets of orange and purple light. The mood is ecstatic. They are laughing, helping each other navigate the technical scrambles, and admiring the geological layers of the rock. At one point, David stops to point out a piece of driftwood wedged high up in a crevice above their heads. He jokes about how high the water must get to put a log up there. They marvel at the power of nature, treating the driftwood like a museum artifact from a distant past. They didn't realize that the log wasn't ancient history, it was a warning. The canyon they were hiking was essentially a funnel. It was the bottom of a drain for a watershed that covered thousands of acres. When rain falls on the slick rock of the high desert, it doesn't soak in. It runs off instantly, gathering speed and volume as it flows downhill, eventually converging into the very crack where Mark, David, and Chloe were eating their granola bars. The turning point in the footage occurs at 11:32 a.m. The group is deep in the narrows section of the canyon. Here, the walls rise 60 to 80 feet straight up on either side, and the passage is barely 4 feet wide in some places. It is a beautiful, claustrophobic cathedral of stone. Mark is filming Chloe as she navigates a small puddle of standing water, trying to keep her boots dry. Suddenly, Mark stops. The camera jerkily pans upward toward the slice of blue sky visible far above them. "Do you hear that?" he asks. The audio picks up a faint, low-frequency vibration. It doesn't sound like water, it sounds like wind, or perhaps a jet plane flying at a very high altitude. David dismisses it, suggesting it's just the wind echoing off the canyon walls. They continue walking for another 30 seconds. But the sound doesn't fade. It grows. It deepens into a mechanical, grinding roar that seems to be coming from the earth itself. The realization happens in real time, and watching it is agonizing. Chloe stops dead in her tracks. She looks at Mark, her face draining of color. "That's not wind," she says. The camera captures the vibration, intensifying until the lens itself seems to shake. The sound is now deafening, a freight train barreling down a tunnel. Mark screams, "Climb! Get up! Now!" But there is nowhere to go. The walls in this section are polished, smooth by thousands of years of flash floods. They are vertical glass. David tries to scramble up a small friction slope, his boots slipping on the sandstone. Mark shoves Chloe toward a small ledge about 4 feet off the ground, barely wide enough for one person. The panic is absolute. There is no buildup. There is no trickle of water to warn them. In a flash flood of this magnitude, the leading edge of the water is a wall of debris, a slurry of mud, boulders, and shattered trees acting as a battering ram. The camera captures the arrival of the flood. It explodes around the bend of the canyon like a brown monster. It isn't water. It is liquid violence. The wave is 10 feet high and moving at 30 miles per hour. The sound on the video clips out, turning into static distortion because the microphone cannot handle the decibel level of the impact. The footage becomes a chaotic blur of brown and gray. We see David look back one last time, his expression one of total disbelief before the wall of sludge hits him. He vanishes instantly, swallowed by the churn. Mark is knocked backward. The camera spins wildly, capturing flashes of the canyon rim, then the water, then the sky. We hear the sickening crunch of bodies hitting rock. Then the lens goes submerged. The audio shifts from the roar of the train to the muffled, grinding clatter of underwater turbulence. It sounds like rocks in a blender. For the next 4 minutes, the GoPro records nothing but darkness and the occasional flash of light as it tumbles downstream. It is being pulverized by rocks and debris. Miraculously, the housing holds. Eventually, the camera snagged on the branch of the cottonwood tree where Elias would find it weeks later. The lens ended up facing outward, documenting the aftermath. The water level in the canyon rose 20 feet in less than 10 minutes. The terrifying roar continued for an hour, a relentless force of nature scrubbing the canyon clean of anything living. Then, as quickly as it started, the water began to recede. The final hour of the battery life shows the water level dropping, leaving behind a thick layer of mud and silence. The blue sky above remained perfectly clear. To a satellite looking down, the desert looked peaceful. Down in the crack, 3 lives had been erased. The recovery of the bodies took 6 days. David was found 5 miles downstream, buried under a pile of timber. Chloe was found 8 miles away. Mark was the furthest. His body had been carried nearly 12 miles into the open desert basin. The medical examiner determined that all 3 died instantly from blunt force trauma before they ever had a chance to drown. The footage from Mark's camera was never released to the public, sealed by the request of the families. However, a transcript of the audio was made available to search and rescue teams. The most haunting part of the file isn't the scream or the crash, it's the conversation 5 minutes before the end. David is heard joking about the heat, saying, "I'd kill for a swim right now." It is a reminder of the cruel irony of the desert. The landscape is indifferent to human life. It doesn't care if you are prepared, it doesn't care if you are young, it just is. And in the slot canyons of Utah, the sky you see isn't the sky that kills you. The initial recovery of the backpack was only the first domino in a chain of forensic discoveries that would haunt the search and rescue community for years. When the sheriff's deputies arrived at the coordinates provided by Elias, the rancher, they weren't just looking for bodies. They were trying to piece together a debris field that stretched for nearly 15 miles across the high desert floor. Flash floods in slot canyons don't just move water. They act like industrial grinders, pulverizing everything in their path against the sandstone walls. The sheer violence of the event meant that identifying personal effects was nearly impossible. A hiking boot found 3 miles downstream was stripped of its laces and sole, reduced to a scrap of leather by the abrasive silt. It was a sobering testament to the forces Mark, David, and Chloe had faced in their final moments. The search effort was massive, involving 3 county agencies, a National Guard helicopter, and dozens of volunteers on horseback and ATVs. The terrain was a nightmare of mud, quicksand, and tangled driftwood piles that could hide a body for decades. The first breakthrough came on day 4, when a cadaver dog alerted on a massive pile of debris lodged in a bend of the wash known as Dead Horse Curve. The dog, a veteran border collie mix named Ranger, refused to leave a specific knot of tamarisk roots and mud. Excavation teams spent 6 hours carefully removing layers of sediment by hand, bucket by bucket. Buried 5 feet deep, encased in mud that had begun to dry into a cement-like tomb, was David. His watch was still on his wrist, stopped at exactly 11:34 a.m. The time of death was precise to the minute. Chloe was found 2 days later, 8 miles downstream from the point of impact. She had been thrown clear of the main channel during the peak of the flood and deposited on a high shelf of rock that was now 10 feet above the receding waterline. The medical examiner noted that her injuries were consistent with multiple high-velocity impacts likely occurring within seconds of the water hitting them. It was a mercy, in a way. The chaos of the flood meant she likely never knew she was drowning. The physical trauma would have rendered her unconscious instantly. Her backpack was still strapped to her shoulders, though shredded. Inside a waterproof pocket, investigators found her phone. Remarkably, it was dry. When powered on, it revealed a series of photos taken just minutes before the end. They showed the group smiling, pointing at the narrow strip of blue sky, completely unaware that the same sky was currently killing them miles away. Mark remained missing for another week. The search had officially scaled back to a recovery operation with fewer volunteers and resources. His parents refused to leave the command post, sleeping in their car at the trailhead, waiting for news that their son wasn't alone in the desert. It was a drone pilot flying a grid pattern over a remote section of the wash near the highway who finally spotted something anomalous. A flash of color that didn't belong in the monochrome landscape of beige and brown. It was a piece of bright blue fabric half buried in a sandbar. Ground teams hiked in, battling heat exhaustion and dehydration to confirm the sighting. It was Mark. He had been carried the furthest, nearly 12 miles from the slot canyon, pushed by the relentless momentum of the water until the wash widened and lost its power. The investigation into the incident revealed a terrifying meteorological perfect storm. The thunderstorm that triggered the flood had occurred 40 miles north over a completely different drainage basin. The rain had fallen on a layer of slick rock known as impermeable crust, meaning zero absorption. Every drop that fell had to go somewhere, and gravity funneled it all into a single narrow exit point, the slot canyon. Radar data showed that the storm dropped 2 inches of rain in 30 minutes, a catastrophic amount for the high desert. The water would have traveled across the open desert as a sheet flood before converging into the canyon, accelerating as the walls narrowed. By the time it reached the hikers, it was a wall of water moving faster than a car on a city street. The GoPro footage, though tragic, provided invaluable data for hydrological researchers. It confirmed that the sound of a flash flood precedes the water by only seconds in deep slot canyons. The acoustic warning, that low, vibrating hum Mark heard, is caused by the air being pushed ahead of the water column, compressed like a piston in an engine. This air blast often carries a distinct smell of ozone and wet earth, a sensory warning that few survive to report. The video also debunked the myth that you can outrun a flash flood. In the narrow confines of a slot canyon, the water moves faster than human reaction time allows. The only survival strategy is to never be in the bottom when the sky turns dark anywhere on the horizon, not just overhead. In the years since the tragedy, the families of Mark, David, and Chloe have worked with the National Park Service to install new warning signs at trailheads across southern Utah. These aren't generic warnings. They are specific, graphic, and urgent. They explain the acoustics of a flood. They explain that blue sky overhead means nothing if storm clouds are visible in the distance. And most importantly, they include a QR code that links to a localized, real-time weather radar specifically calibrated for the drainage basins, not just the general forecast. The goal is to give future hikers the one thing Mark, David, and Chloe didn't have: information that matches the reality of the terrain. The canyon itself remains unchanged. The next monsoon season washed away the last physical traces of the accident, the scars on the rock walls, the debris piles, the lost gear. Nature is efficient at cleaning up its own violence. But for the locals, the canyon feels different now. The guides who lead tours in the area often stop at the bend where the video was taken. They ask their groups for a moment of silence, listening to the wind. They tell the story not as a ghost story, but as a lesson in humility. The desert is beautiful, they say, but it is also honest. It doesn't hide its dangers. It just demands that you learn to read them before it's too late. And if you ever hear a sound like a jet engine where no plane should be, don't look for the source. Just climb. The stories. Never accept a ride from this Nevada highway turnout. Back in 1998, a totally broken down car sat by a lonely highway turnout near Tonopah, Nevada. State records often conflict about the exact time, but dispatch logs show a 911 call happening around midnight. Investigators never confirmed what really happened to the guy who supposedly asked a passing trucker for a ride. Some locals claimed the dark area was super creepy and regular drivers usually didn't stop there at night. Mark Hinson was a 34-year-old truck driver hauling heavy steel pipes all across the state. He pulled his massive rig into the dirt turnout just 50 miles south of the main city limits. He just wanted to stretch his legs and quickly check his tires before driving the rest of the night. He grabbed his heavy flashlight and hopped out of the cab into the freezing cold desert night air. That was when he noticed a really beat-up dark sedan sitting quietly near the dry desert bushes. The county file from 2009 mentions the car had flat tires and completely shattered front windows. Mark walked over slowly to see if anyone was hurt or maybe needed some help fixing their engine. Archived notes say he found an older guy just sitting perfectly still on a big rock behind the car. The stranger had on super dirty clothes and just stared at the ground without blinking or saying anything. Mark shouted over the loud wind to ask if the guy needed a lift to the nearest gas station. The creepy man quietly asked to get dropped off at a specific crossroad about 20 miles down the road. Records conflict on what they actually talked about, but Mark felt sorry for him and unlocked the passenger door. They drove down the pitch-black highway in totally awkward silence while the wind kept howling outside the truck. Mark kept glancing over, but the old guy wouldn't look at him and just stared out the dark window. State records show the radio suddenly started blasting weird, loud static whenever they drove under big power lines. Sarah Miller was a 28-year-old nurse driving back to Reno after visiting her mom all weekend. She was driving a little silver car and stayed roughly 10 miles behind Mark and his huge freight truck. She told the cops later that the big rig ahead of her started driving in a really crazy way. The truck swerved hard all over the empty lanes before slamming on the brakes right near a concrete bridge. Sarah slowed her car down right away and pulled over on the dirt shoulder so she wouldn't crash. Archived notes show Sarah saw the passenger door fly wide open while the heavy truck was still slowly moving. Someone wearing dark clothes tumbled out into the dirt and scrambled straight down the really steep hill right there. Mark stopped the truck completely and jumped out of his side, looking like he was totally freaking out. Sarah ran up to him and loudly asked if he was hurt or if he needed a doctor fast. Some locals claimed the cold wind carried a nasty smell like old metal that just hung in the air. Mark kept yelling that the quiet guy had suddenly grabbed the steering wheel without any warning at all. He told Sarah the weird hitchhiker was crazy strong and almost flipped the whole truck into the deep ditch. Investigators never confirmed if a real fight actually happened inside the tiny space of the moving truck cab. Sarah went back to her trunk and grabbed a bright red flare to light up the dark hill drop. She shined her flashlight down the rocky slope but couldn't find any sign of the creepy guy anywhere. Dispatch logs show Sarah used her big cell phone right away to call the highway patrol for some help. 2 uniformed cops showed up about 40 minutes later and started looking all around the messy dirt turnout area. They checked out the thick bushes and loose rocks, but didn't find any fresh footprints in the sandy dirt. State records conflict about if the cops actually brought a tracking dog out there to search the dark desert. The strange guy just vanished into the tough landscape without leaving a single piece of real evidence behind. Mark told the cops exactly what went down while he stood freezing next to his loud, idling freight truck. He swore the weird guy had super cold hands that felt just like solid ice when they were fighting. Some locals claimed hitchhikers used to go missing around this empty highway stretch a lot back in the 70s. Sarah backed up his story about the crazy swerving, but she admitted she never actually saw the guy's face. The county file from 2009 has a few really blurry Polaroid pictures of the original dirt turnout. The detectives went back to the gravel stop the next morning to check out that broken-down dark sedan. They quickly saw the beat-up car didn't have any license plates and the registration papers were totally gone. State records point out the engine was completely rusted over and definitely hadn't run in a really long time. Dispatch logs say the main cop found an old leather wallet shoved way under the driver's side floor mat. The worn wallet only had blank pieces of paper and a super faded business card for a ruined motel. Mark went back to his regular driving job, but kept feeling a super strong sense of heavy, dark dread. He called his boss and begged for a totally different highway route for all his future heavy pipe deliveries. Archive notes say his boss flat out said no because the new path would take 4 extra hours driving. Mark just quit his really good job 2 weeks later and moved far away to the East Coast permanently. Investigators never confirmed if his sudden move was actually because he was terrified of that dark desert highway trip. Sarah started having these awful nightmares about a guy with no face staring at her from a deep hole. She finally went to see a doctor about her bad anxiety, but state records keep her medical files private. Some locals claimed Sarah put up super bright security lights all around her house right after the police interview. She stopped driving by herself at night and always kept a heavy police scanner radio right next to her. Records conflict on whether she ever tried to take back any part of her original story to the cops. Another really weird 911 call came from a highway emergency phone box in the fall of 2011. A scared anonymous caller said an old guy was banging hard on the locked door of their family RV. Dispatch logs show state troopers got there exactly 12 minutes later, but the dusty turnout was completely dead empty. The county file from 2009 talks about a bunch of similar secret reports from scared, tired drivers. Investigators never confirmed who that aggressive, crazy guy wandering around the empty Nevada desert actually was in the end. A smart local history buff named David Vance recently spent 3 months digging through the messy police archives. David was a 50-year-old former reporter who really wanted solid answers about the creepy local highway stories. He actually found a Lost City report from 1982 about a really bad, deadly pedestrian traffic crash. Archive notes say a stranded driver got hit super hard by a massive speeding freight truck on that road. State records conflict pretty badly about what the poor dead guy in that older fatal crash actually looked like. Some locals claimed the ghost story was just made up to stop sleepy drivers from parking there illegally overnight. David talked to a few retired cops who definitely remembered seeing that broken sedan sitting at the dirt turnout. One older cop actually admitted he was the guy who towed the ruined car away so people wouldn't panic. The retired guy wouldn't talk about it anymore and quickly hung up the phone while David was still recording. Investigators never confirmed where the smashed sedan ended up or if the junkyard guys just crushed it down. You can still pull off into that lonely gravel turnout today, even with all the creepy internet rumors around. A really old wooden sign just tells drivers to watch out for crazy winds and warns there aren't bathrooms. Dispatch logs still get weird calls sometimes about sneaky dark shadows hanging out near the distant dry desert bushes. Most smart truckers just skip the dark spot entirely and sleep at a nice bright gas station up ahead. The county file from 2009 officially calls the crazy 1998 case a totally unsolved mystery. A freelance reporter tried to get the original 911 audio tapes from 1998 just this past winter. State records weirdly say those exact tape reels got totally destroyed when the police basement flooded out one night. Investigators never confirmed how water even got inside that super secure concrete storage vault room during a dry year. Some locals claimed the cops hid the truth on purpose so tourists wouldn't get too scared to visit Nevada. The county file from 2009 doesn't have any backup computer copies of the missing audio tape recordings. Mark Hinson wouldn't talk to any podcast hosts later on and completely deleted all his online social media pages. Sarah Miller kind of fell off the map too after she changed her secret home phone number 2 different times. Dispatch logs are pretty much the only hard proof showing how crazy things got on that cold, empty road. Archive notes stick to the idea that the creepy hitchhiker was just a lost homeless guy with mental issues. State records therefore treat the scary truck fight like a random, weird event that doesn't need any more investigating, is less than #. Zero hash is greater than. A weird online forum user reportedly posted a crazy theory about the missing hitchhiker guy back in 2014. The guy claimed he used to work night shifts at a tiny dirty gas station right outside of Tonopah. He swore an older man wearing those exact same dirty clothes walked into his quiet store one freezing night. Dispatch logs never showed any police calls from that specific gas station during that whole entire winter season, though. Investigators never confirmed if this late-night store worker was actually telling the truth or just making stuff up. The station worker said the old guy just stood totally still near the back coolers staring at the glass. State records conflict about whether the local stores even had working security cameras installed back in those rough days. He claimed the smelly stranger bought a basic road map and paid with super old, dirty, crumbled dollar bills. Archive notes mention a similar weird payment happening at a diner down the street a few days before that. Some locals claimed the guy was probably just a wandering desert hermit who didn't know how to act normal. Mark thought he was doing a really nice thing by checking on a stranded guy in the freezing cold. Some locals claimed doing a nice thing out in the deep desert is actually the fastest way to die. The county file from 2009 definitely proves that some secrets are better left alone in the dark. Dispatch logs still sit in the dusty local archives, just waiting for another tired driver to read them over. You probably shouldn't ever stop your car if you see an empty, beat-up sedan on a dirt road. The stories. The most disturbing logs of trapped climbers. Deep in the remote sections of the Cascade Range, harsh weather conditions often conceal the tragic fates of missing hikers. Unpredictable storms can trap even the most experienced outdoorsmen in frozen landscapes with absolutely no hope of a rapid rescue. A county file from 2012 details one such event that continues to baffle local search and rescue teams. Investigators never confirmed what exactly happened inside a high-altitude snow cave during a particularly violent winter blizzard that November. Arthur Pendleton was a 34-year-old structural engineer who spent most of his free time exploring difficult summits. His climbing partner was a 32-year-old paramedic named Julian Vance, who possessed extensive wilderness first aid training. Their primary goal was to test experimental cold weather survival gear during a planned 3-day ascent in northern Washington. State records indicate they obtained the proper backcountry permits on a seemingly clear Friday morning before beginning their steep hike. The two men departed from a desolate trailhead parking lot and headed aggressively toward a notoriously difficult and jagged ridge. Weather forecasts predicted relatively calm skies for the duration of the weekend, with only mild winds expected at higher elevations. Other climbing groups reportedly saw Arthur and Julian making excellent time as they bypassed the lower timberline by late afternoon. They carried a heavy satellite radio unit that was specifically designed to transmit distress signals through thick mountain cloud cover. Archived notes from the local ranger station show that the climbers radioed a routine status update just before sunset arrived. Conditions changed drastically during the very early hours of Saturday morning when an unpredicted heavy storm front slammed the region. Temperatures plummeted well below zero as blinding snow completely obscured the narrow mountain trails and trapped several groups of hikers. Dispatch logs reveal that regional emergency services began receiving numerous panic calls from other stranded climbers across the vast range. Most people managed to hunker down in established alpine shelters or successfully retreated to lower elevations before the blizzard peaked. Arthur and Julian were positioned far above the safety of the tree line when the storm violently halted their progress. They constructed a temporary snow cave into the side of a steep glacial wall to escape the punishing wind gusts. At approximately 2 in the morning, base camp operators received the first highly unusual radio transmission from the stranded men. Julian reported that they were safely enclosed inside their ice shelter, but mentioned hearing heavy footsteps directly above their heads. He asked the operator if any other climbing teams were registered to be on that specific isolated section of ridge. The base camp dispatcher explicitly confirmed that absolutely no one else was documented within a 5-mile radius of them. Static heavily distorted the communication feed as Julian argued with Arthur in the background about an unknown sound outside. Arthur took the microphone and calmly stated that something large was continuously circling the thick, icy perimeter of their cave. He noted the structural integrity of their snow shelter was perfectly fine, but the persistent noise was preventing any sleep. Radio contact abruptly ceased for roughly 6 hours as the blizzard outside reached historically dangerous and completely blinding wind speeds. Dispatch logs show an incoming signal flared up again shortly after 8 in the morning on that freezing Sunday. This particular transmission consisted entirely of heavy breathing and the unmistakable sound of metal scraping violently against solid glacial ice. The dispatcher repeatedly asked for their status, but received absolutely no vocal response from either of the trapped climbing partners. Some locals claimed the radio frequencies in that specific mountain corridor frequently pick up phantom interference from old mining equipment. A final decipherable message broke through the heavy radio static late Sunday evening, just as the storm finally began breaking. Julian spoke in a hushed and terrified whisper while repeatedly stating that the entrance to their cave had been unblocked. He explicitly told the dispatcher that they had not moved the snow wall and the exterior tracks made no sense. The paramedic requested immediate emergency evacuation while claiming Arthur was staring out into the dark wilderness without saying a word. Search and rescue helicopters deployed at first light on Monday morning when the harsh sky cleared enough to permit safe flying. State records indicate a specialized ground team also hiked up the treacherous eastern slope to reach the last known coordinates. It took rescuers over 9 grueling hours to navigate the massive fresh snowdrifts and locate the exact ridge in question. They eventually spotted a partially collapsed snow cave tucked beneath a large granite overhang near the absolute peak of the mountain. The ground team cautiously approached the icy structure and immediately noticed several highly alarming details scattered around the snowy perimeter. All of the expensive experimental cold weather gear was neatly folded and stacked right outside the gaping entrance of the cave. There were absolutely no visible footprints leading away from the shelter in any direction across the pristine white mountain powder. Rescuers discovered the heavy satellite radio sitting directly in the center of the dark cave with its battery completely drained. A small waterproof notebook belonging to Arthur was recovered near a pile of unlit flare sticks inside the frozen shelter. Archive notes from the subsequent investigation reveal that the final journal entry was written with erratic and heavily pressed handwriting. The engineer had documented a detailed timeline of the severe storm while also sketching bizarre geometric patterns across the pages. He wrote that the persistent circling sounds outside eventually stopped but were immediately replaced by a rhythmic tapping on ice. His very last written sentence simply stated that Julian had agreed to go outside and investigate the strange rhythmic noise. This specific written claim directly contradicted the final radio transmission where Julian stated Arthur was the one staring outside silently. Investigators never confirmed which of the two men actually breached the snow wall or why their survival gear was abandoned. Medical professionals analyzed the journal and suggested severe altitude sickness combined with hypothermia likely caused massive collective auditory hallucinations. However, the perfectly neat stacking of their protective clothing outside the freezing cave did not align with typical hypothermic delirium. Rescue crews expanded their intensive grid search across the dangerous upper elevations for nearly 2 entire weeks without finding anything. Avalanche dogs were brought to the remote summit but failed to pick up any human scent trails beneath the snowpack. County file records show the official search was indefinitely suspended right before the next major winter storm blanketed the region. Both the structural engineer and the seasoned paramedic were permanently classified as lost to the unforgiving mountain environment that winter. Several independent mountaineering experts later reviewed the chilling dispatch logs and expressed deep confusion regarding the final radio battery levels. The specific satellite unit they carried was engineered to maintain power for at least 10 days in sub-zero alpine environments. It should not have been completely dead by Sunday evening unless someone deliberately disabled the internal thermal power cell mechanism. Some locals claimed they saw strange, distant lights moving methodically across that exact ridgeline during the height of the blizzard. An experienced private tracker named David Vance spent the following summer combing the rocky slopes, hoping to find his brother. He discovered a single frozen climbing boot wedged tightly between 2 massive boulders almost 3 miles from the original campsite. The heavy boot was physically identified as belonging to Arthur, but the sturdy laces had been meticulously sliced clean through. State records indicate that no knife or cutting tool was ever reported missing from their heavily documented equipment supply inventory. Finding that sliced boot so far from the snow cave only generated more complicated questions for the baffled local authorities. The terrain between the shelter and the boulder field was incredibly treacherous and virtually impossible to navigate without proper footwear. Records conflict on whether a frantic, freezing man could have covered that much rough distance in the middle of darkness. Investigators never confirmed if the boot was carried there by an animal or if Arthur somehow walked there barefoot himself. Years later, a digital audio specialist reportedly isolated the heavy background scraping noises from that confusing Sunday morning radio transmission. The enhanced frequencies allegedly revealed faint, rhythmic breathing patterns that did not match human respiratory rates under severe high distress. The specialist handed these findings over to the authorities, but the county file from 2012 remains largely unmodified. Official investigators consistently maintain that extreme weather conditions and severe psychological breakdown are the only logical explanations for this tragedy. The towering mountain peak continues to attract thrill seekers despite the dark history surrounding that highly isolated and jagged ridge. Occasional summer hikers still occasionally report finding small metallic fragments scattered far across the desolate granite stones in the area. These tiny fragments reportedly match the casing material of the specific experimental gear left behind by the two doomed climbers. The deeply unsettling radio transmissions and the bizarrely abandoned equipment ensure this particular wilderness case remains completely and utterly unresolved. A retired ranger reportedly gave an anonymous interview regarding the deeply classified sections of the original 2012 investigation. He claimed the initial rescue squad found strange, deep indentations in the hard-packed ice just outside the ruined cave. The official state records omitted this specific detail because the unnatural shape of the marks directly contradicted standard avalanche physics. Investigators never confirmed the existence of these strange, icy impressions since the afternoon sunlight quickly melted any remaining physical evidence. Julian had actually survived a highly publicized and deadly avalanche incident roughly 5 years prior to this doomed Washington expedition. His profound experience in extreme mountain survival situations makes his apparent mental collapse during the terrifying storm seem highly improbable. Archive notes show he previously lectured younger climbers about the strict importance of never leaving a shelter during a whiteout. The seasoned paramedic abandoning his heavy protective gear runs completely contrary to every single wilderness protocol he professionally taught others. The remote glacial wall where they pitched their final camp eventually collapsed during a massive geological shift 2 years later. This total destruction of the primary physical site guaranteed that no further forensic expeditions could ever be safely organized there. Dispatch logs from that terrifying weekend are currently heavily guarded at the Maine State Archives and rarely accessed by anyone. The terrifying mystery of what truly lured those experienced men out into the lethal freezing void will likely never end. Local law enforcement periodically receives random anonymous tips regarding the missing men whenever a new climbing documentary is widely broadcast. These unverified reports often describe seeing two disoriented figures wandering mindlessly through the dense pine forests near the lower timberline. Search teams always investigate these claims, but they inevitably find nothing but empty wilderness and undisturbed tracks of local wildlife. Some locals claimed the mountain actively traps the conscious minds of those who perish in the freezing high-altitude storms. The surviving family members eventually erected a small memorial plaque near the barren trailhead parking lot where the journey began. This bronze monument serves as a stark warning to other ambitious climbers who dare to challenge the violently unpredictable weather. The county file from 2012 will technically remain an open missing persons case until physical bodies are recovered. Until that highly unlikely day arrives, the dark secrets of that frozen ridge will stay buried beneath the heavy snow. In this news story, the Mott unsettling disappearance in West Virginia. The Monongahela National Forest covers nearly 1 million acres of the most rugged, unforgiving terrain in the eastern United States. It is a place of deep hollows, dense rhododendron thickets that can swallow a man whole, and jagged limestone ridges that hide thousands of unmapped cave systems. To the locals living in Pocahontas County, the forest is simply the green, a massive, breathing entity that keeps its secrets well. In late October of 2014, a 34-year-old land surveyor named Elias Vance drove his Ford F-150 into a remote section of the forest known as the Cranberry Wilderness. Elias wasn't a tourist. He was a third-generation West Virginian who had spent his entire life navigating the backwoods. He had been hired by a private timber holding company to mark the boundary lines of a 100-acre parcel that hadn't been surveyed since the 1950s. He parked his truck at a rusted gate off a gravel fire road, checked his GPS equipment, and radioed his dispatcher to confirm his drop-off time. He planned to spend 3 days in the woods camping solo to complete the job. He had enough food for 5 days, a satellite phone for emergencies, and a .45 caliber sidearm for bears. Elias was competent, careful, and completely alone. He locked his truck at 8 in the morning on a Tuesday. It would be the last time anyone saw him alive. The first 2 days of the survey went exactly according to plan. Elias checked in with his dispatcher every evening at 6 p.m. using the satellite phone. His voice logs were calm, professional, and boring. He complained about the density of the underbrush and the steepness of the ravines, but he reported no issues with equipment or safety. On the third day, the weather began to turn. A low-pressure system stalled over the Allegheny Mountains, dropping the temperature into the low 30s and bringing a thick, heavy fog that settled into the valleys like wet wool. The visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. At 6 p.m. on Thursday, the dispatcher waited for Elias's check-in call. The phone rang, but the line was dead silence. There was no static, no voice, just an open line that remained connected for 22 seconds before cutting out. The dispatcher tried to call back immediately, but the call went straight to voicemail. This wasn't immediately alarming. Satellite signals in the deep hollows of West Virginia are notoriously spotty. The company protocol was to wait 12 hours before initiating a search. By Friday morning, Elias still hadn't checked in. The company notified the Pocahontas County Sheriff's Department, and a search team was deployed to the location of his truck. The vehicle was exactly where he had left it, locked and undisturbed. Inside, deputies found his wallet, his lunch cooler, and a map with his intended route highlighted in yellow marker. The search and rescue team, consisting of state troopers and local volunteers, began to sweep the grid Elias was supposed to be surveying. The terrain was brutal. The rhododendrons were so thick in places that searchers had to crawl on their hands and knees to move forward. For the first 48 hours, they found absolutely nothing. No footprints, no snagged clothing, no fire pits. It was as if Elias had stepped out of his truck and evaporated into the fog. But on the third day of the search, a tracking dog named Blue picked up a scent near a limestone outcropping 3 miles north of the truck. The dog led the handlers down a steep, scree-covered slope into a narrow box canyon that wasn't on any of the topographical maps. At the bottom of the canyon, the search team found Elias's campsite. It was a scene that confused the seasoned investigators immediately. The tent was set up perfectly, the rain fly taut and secured. Inside, his sleeping bag was unrolled and his boots were placed neatly by the door. His GPS unit was sitting on top of his sleeping bag, turned off. But what made no sense was the condition of the campsite's perimeter. Elias had constructed a ring of large stones around the tent, almost like a barrier. Outside of that ring, he had cleared the brush away down to the bare dirt in a perfect circle with a 20-foot radius. It looked frantic. There was no fire pit. Instead, investigators found 6 burnt-out road flares tossed in various directions away from the tent. Elias hadn't packed road flares for a survey job. These were old magnesium flares that he must have had in his emergency kit for years. The fact that he had burned all of them suggested he was trying to keep something away or trying to see something in the dark desperately. The most disturbing piece of evidence was found 50 yards away from the tent, wedged into the fork of a birch tree about 7 feet off the ground. It was Elias's digital voice recorder. Surveyors used these to dictate notes about property corners and terrain features. The batteries were nearly dead, but the lead investigator managed to power it on. The first 20 files were standard observations about tree species and elevation markers. The tone was mundane, but the final file, timestamped at 3 a.m. on that missing Thursday night, was different. It didn't contain survey notes. It recorded 40 minutes of audio. The first 10 minutes are just the sound of Elias breathing heavily close to the microphone. He is whispering, but the words are unintelligible, almost like he is praying or talking to himself in a loop. Then, at the 12-minute mark, a sound cuts through the background noise. It isn't a bear, and it isn't a coyote. It sounds like heavy, wet footsteps circling the campsite. They are rhythmic and bipedal. 2 feet. Crunch, crunch, stop, crunch, crunch, stop. Elias is heard shifting in his tent. The zipper of the tent door opens slowly. The audio quality is crisp enough to hear the fabric sliding. "Who is that?" Elias asks. His voice is trembling. "I have a gun. Identify yourself." There is no response from the woods. No animal chuffing, no rustling of leaves, just silence. Then, a sound that defies explanation. From a distance that audio engineers later estimated to be less than 20 feet away, a voice mimics Elias perfectly. It repeats, "Who is that? I have a gun." It isn't a recording. It has a flat, metallic timbre to it, like a parrot trying to speak human, but the pitch and cadence are identical to Elias. On the tape, Elias gasps. "Stop it," he whispers. The voice in the woods repeats, "Stop it." The mimicry is instantaneous. This continues for 5 agonizing minutes. Elias says a word. The thing in the fog repeats it back to him with 0 delay. It wasn't mocking him. It sounded like it was learning him. The recording ends violently. There is a loud tearing sound like nylon ripping, followed by the distinct crack of a .45 caliber gunshot. Then the recorder hits the ground, presumably thrown or dropped, and the file cuts to static. The search team focused their efforts on the area surrounding the birch tree where the recorder was found. They located the shell casing from the gunshot buried in the leaf litter. They also found the bullet. It was lodged in the trunk of a massive oak tree. Elias hadn't fired at a person or an animal. He had fired blindly into the dark, but the most confusing aspect was the lack of tracks. The ground was soft from the recent rain. Elias's boot prints were clearly visible around the tent and leading to the tree. But there were no other footprints. Whatever had been circling his tent, whatever had been mimicking his voice from 20 feet away, had left no physical impression on the mud. It was physically impossible for a human or a large animal to walk there without leaving a trace. The search continued for 2 more weeks. They brought in thermal drones, cadaver dogs from 3 states, and hundreds of volunteers. They combed every cave entrance and sinkhole within a 10-mile radius. They found his surveyor's pole 3 miles up the ridge, snapped in half. They found his hat floating in a creek another mile east, but they never found Elias Vance. The official report listed his cause of death as exposure, undetermined, but the local sheriff refused to close the file. The audio recording was sent to the FBI forensics lab in Quantico for enhancement. The analysts there concluded that the second voice on the tape, the one mimicking Elias, did not match the frequency signature of a human vocal cord. It lacked the subtle breath variances that occur when air passes through a larynx. They couldn't say what it was, only that it was produced mechanically or by an anatomy that wasn't human. In the years since 2014, the Cranberry Wilderness has seen other strange incidents, though none as well documented as the Vance disappearance. Hikers report hearing their own names called out from the ridgelines. Hunters talk about the mimic, a local legend that predates the Civil War, about a presence in the woods that steals voices to lure travelers off the path. Most people dismiss these as campfire stories. But the family of Elias Vance doesn't dismiss them. They listened to the tape. They heard the terror in a man who had spent his life in the woods and knew exactly what a bear or a bobcat sounded like. Elias wasn't afraid of nature. He was afraid of something that sounded like him but wasn't him. The final detail that keeps the case active in the minds of the locals involves the satellite phone log. Remember the 22 seconds of silence when the dispatcher tried to call? The phone company records showed that the call was answered. Someone picked up, they didn't speak. They just listened. And the GPS triangulation for that call put the phone not in the campsite, but moving at 40 miles per hour straight through the dense forest in a straight line at a speed no human could run in that terrain. The investigation into the disappearance of Elias Vance didn't end when the official search was suspended. In fact, that was when the real strangeness began to surface, buried in the raw data files that the county sheriff had overlooked. The family hired a private investigator named Harlan Graves, a retired federal agent who specialized in cold cases involving wilderness disappearances. Harlan wasn't interested in ghost stories or local folklore about mimics. He was interested in logistics. He requested the raw triangulation data from the cell tower that had pinged Elias's satellite phone during that silent 22-second call. The police report stated the phone was moving at 40 miles per hour. Harlan looked at the topography. The line of movement cut straight across a ravine known as Hell's Drop. It was a sheer cliff face with a 300-foot vertical drop. No human could run 40 miles per hour through a forest, but more importantly, no vehicle could traverse that specific terrain. The phone hadn't been carried by a person running. It had been moving through the air. This revelation shifted the theory from a lost hiker scenario to something far more complex. Harlan suggested that perhaps Elias had been abducted, and the phone was thrown from a moving vehicle on a distant logging road. But the signal triangulation placed the device deep in the roadless wilderness, miles from any gravel track. The only logical explanation was that the phone had been carried by a large bird of prey, perhaps an owl or an eagle that had scavenged the campsite. It was a neat, tidy theory. It explained the movement and the speed, but it didn't explain the fact that the call was answered. A bird can't press the accept button on a tactical satellite phone. That requires a thumb and significant pressure. Someone or something with dexterity had pressed that button while moving at highway speeds over a cliff. Harlan noted in his case file that the impossibility of the data suggested a glitch, but the cell provider insisted their equipment was functioning perfectly. 3 years passed without a single physical clue surfacing. The cranberry wilderness absorbed the seasons, burying whatever evidence remained under layers of decaying leaves and snow. Then, in November of 2017, a bear hunter named Miller was tracking a wounded buck 5 miles east of where Elias's truck had been parked. Miller had pushed deep into a limestone karst field, an area riddled with sinkholes and narrow fissures. He sat down on a mossy log to rest and noticed something white protruding from a fox den about 10 yards away. He assumed it was a deer antler. When he pulled it loose from the mud, he realized he was holding a human ulna, the forearm bone. He marked the GPS coordinates and hiked out to alert the authorities. The location was baffling. It was on the opposite side of the ridge from where the phone data had pinged. If Elias had walked here, he would have had to cross a raging river that was unfordable in October. The recovery team spent 2 days excavating the sinkhole. They found skeletal remains scattered over a 50-yard radius, consistent with animal scavenging. Dental records confirmed the identity within 48 hours. It was Elias Vance. But the autopsy raised more questions than it answered. The bones showed no signs of trauma. No bullet holes, no knife marks, no crushing injuries from a fall. The cause of death was officially undetermined. However, the clothing found near the remains told a disturbing story. Elias's heavy surveyor's coat was found folded. Not torn off, not discarded in a panic, but folded neatly into a square and placed inside a hollow stump. His boots were placed side by side next to the coat, laces tied together. This behavior is sometimes associated with severe hypothermia, a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing, where the victim feels intensely hot as their brain shuts down. But people suffering from hypothermia don't fold their laundry, they tear their clothes off in a frenzy. This was deliberate. This was organized. Harlan Graves returned to the site of the remains to conduct his own assessment. He found something the police forensics team had missed because they weren't looking for it. About 20 feet above the sinkhole, wedged into a crack in the limestone cliff, was a small plastic object. It was the battery pack cover for a satellite phone. It matched the model Elias carried. Harlan realized that the phone hadn't been carried by a bird. It had likely been dropped from the cliff above. He rappelled down the face of the drop and found scrape marks on the stone, faint, vertical scratches that looked like they were made by something climbing up, not falling down. The spacing of the scratches was wrong for a bear. They were too wide, too methodical. It looked like someone with climbing gear had ascended the sheer face in the dark. But Elias didn't have climbing gear. The final piece of the puzzle came from the audio analysis of the mimic tape found at the original campsite. In 2019, a university linguist contacted the family with a new theory. She had run the recording through a spectrographic analyzer used to study avian vocalizations. She discovered a sub-frequency sound embedded in the audio below the range of human hearing. It was a rapid clicking noise similar to echolocation used by bats or dolphins. The clicking accelerated right before the mimic voice spoke. Her theory was terrifyingly grounded in biology. The voice wasn't a recording, it was being produced by a biological larynx that was modifying its shape to copy the sound waves it had just heard. It was a hunting tactic, a predator mimicking the call of prey to draw it out of safety. In this case, the prey was a man with a gun, and the predator was smart enough to know that a human voice would make him hesitate just long enough. The case of Elias Vance remains technically closed as an accidental death due to exposure, but you won't find a local surveyor who will work in that specific sector of the Cranberry Wilderness alone. The coordinates of the sinkhole are shared quietly among the timber crews as a no-go zone. The official explanation is that the terrain is too dangerous, too prone to rock slides. But the truth is simpler. They avoid it because of the silence. Hunters who go near that ridge report that the birds stop singing. The wind dies down. And sometimes, if you sit very still and listen to the fog, you might hear a voice that sounds exactly like yours, asking you to identify yourself. And if you hear that, the locals say, "Don't answer. Just run."